one submarine, and up to 200 nuclear warheads on board. 200 cities, each with its own name, its own streets, with people who, at that very minute, had no idea it even existed. One ship could end them all. And now something strange. Inside this doomsday machine, there was a swimming pool, a real one, with water. There was a sauna, and there was a separate cabin where smoking was allowed. You won't find that on any other submarine in the world. It was the size of a 9-story building, longer than 2 football fields placed end to end, and yet seeing it was almost impossible. It went where neither satellite nor foreign ship could reach, under the ice. The largest weapon ever built by man. And here's what won't let me rest in this whole story. How a country that built it then handed this giant over to be cut up, sent under the blade. And why the one who paid for it to be gone was its main enemy. This machine has an entry in the Guinness Book of Records, and so far, no one has beaten it. The largest submarine humanity has ever built. Project 941, name Akula. And in the West, it was called something else. Typhoon. 48,000 tons. That's how much it weighs when fully submerged. That's more than an aircraft carrier weighs. One ship, heavier than a floating airfield with its planes. When I first read this, honestly, I didn't believe it. I double-checked in 3 places. It all adds up. Length, 172 meters. That's 2 football fields laid end to end. Width, 23 meters. And in height, if you count from keel to the top of the sail, it's like a residential building 9 stories tall with 5 entrances. Imagine, you walk along your apartment block and the whole thing, goes underwater. The whole thing. And there's still a reserve left over. 6 of them were built. All 6, in the Northern Fleet in 1 Division, the 18th, base, Nerpitia Bay, Zapadnaya Litsa, the Kola Peninsula. A place where getting in as an outsider was almost unthinkable, even in your imagination. From there they went out to sea, and from there they returned, those that returned. And here I want to make one caveat. For those who've been watching us for a long time, we've already told the story of its younger sister. Remember the video about the Lyra, Project 705? The same audacious Soviet engineering idea, only with the opposite sign. The Lyra was small, nimble, titanium, a record holder for speed and depth, a hound. And the Typhoon is its complete opposite. Not a hound, but an elephant. Not speed, but mass. Not a hunter, but a platform. But notice, behind these 2 projects stands the same drive. That very Soviet designer's drive when people were told, make us something no one else has. And they did, sometimes on the edge of common sense. With the Typhoon, it was exactly like that. What hooked me in this story from the very start is this. Everyone is used to a submarine being something narrow, long, fast. And here, a floating mountain. Inside, echoing passageways, whole floors, compartments, 19 of them. 2 huge pressure hulls side by side, like 2 pipes joined on the outside by one common hull. It looks like nothing else at all. And someone dreamed up this mountain, someone approved it, someone laid it down on the slipway and saw it through to the sea. And not just 1, 6. On this hull alone, more than 1,000 enterprises across the whole country worked, from the Caspian to Vladivostok. 1,000 factories for a single series of submarines. For what? On this question, honestly, I got stuck for a long time. Because the answers lying on the surface, they're somehow too simple. The arms race, the Cold War, an answer to America. All true. But explaining 48,000 tons with a single phrase, an answer to America, doesn't work. The American's Ohio weighs almost 3 times less. So there's something else here. Something specific that pushed the designers into such a size. Something we didn't have and had to work around in exactly this way, with gigantism. I'll come back to this in a minute, there's a curious fork there. But for now, something short, our way. Subscribe if you want stories like these from the channel not to disappear from your feed. And I repeat, about its little sister, the Lyra, we have a separate video. If you missed it, I'll leave it in the description. So then, back to the question of why. You know, it's interesting. When I was digging into this, I thought the size was set by the customer. The military came and said, We want the biggest submarine in the world. Turns out, no. The size wasn't set by the customer. The size was set by one specific piece of hardware. It was itself so enormous that the submarine had to be built around it. The piece of hardware was called R-39, otherwise RSM-52. By NATO classification, Sturgeon. A naval ballistic missile, solid fuel, 3 stages. Launch weight, nearly 90 tons. Length, 16 meters. That's, to put it very simply, a chunk of iron with a nuclear filling the size of a 4-story building. One such chunk. And they had to cram them into the submarine, 20 of them. Now you understand where the 48,000 tons came from. Not out of thin air, not from someone's fantasy, from a very concrete task, how to fit 20 houses inside one ship. Here we need to step back a little, literally a couple of steps, to make clear why such a task arose at all. Early 70s. The Cold War had long since stopped being anything new. Everyone had gotten used to it, like bad weather. But the rules of the game at sea were slowly changing. The Americans had a new program coming, Trident, that is, treasure bets. A new solid fuel missile, a new submarine, Ohio, designed for 24 missiles, range over 7,000 kilometers. And the whole design came out fairly compact. Their Ohio weighs about 18,500 tons, almost 3 times less than our Typhoon. Remember this figure, it'll come in handy. The Soviet Union had an answer, or rather, one was supposed to appear. In December 1972, a government decree came out to begin designing a new submarine cruiser, and in parallel, a new missile for it. Already under the index R-39, the task sounded calm, catch up and preferably surpass in characteristics. But behind this calm wording hid one very unpleasant thing. The thing is that solid rocket fuel was not our field at all. The Americans had been working with solid fuel naval missiles since the 60s, Polaris, then Poseidon. They had a school, an industry, proven charges. On our submarines, everything ran on liquid fuel. Our own familiar but capricious, toxic, and, let's be honest, dangerous. About the R-29, I'll probably record a separate video someday. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. And here it was decided. It's time for us to make a solid fuel naval missile too. The first serial one in the country. And it came out, only with a caveat. By mass, it turned out almost twice as heavy as the American first-generation Trident. By length, about a third longer. Range, comparable, about 8,000 kilometers. And the warhead, up to 10 independent blocks, each with its own nuclear charge, each aimed at its own target, against 8 for the Americans. That is, in firepower, overkill. In size, also overkill, but in the other direction. And so the designers sit. I picture it like this: a big sheet of drafting paper, a drawing of the submarine, a drawing of the missile. The missile has to stand upright vertically in a silo, 20 of them. We count in our heads, we estimate. 20 silos about 2.5 meters in diameter, nearly 17 long. An ordinary submarine can't swallow that. It physically cannot. And here someone, I think, says the phrase that decides it all. Then the submarine won't be ordinary. The Machine Building Design Bureau from Mias, Chelyabinsk region took on developing the missile. This is the old Mikheyev school. Viktor Petrovich Mikheyev, general designer, a living legend of naval missiles. All Soviet submarine missiles, starting from the very first ones, that's his school. The D-19 complex, that's what they were making. And a small detail that for some reason stuck with me. The first stages of the R-39 missile were made at the Ukrainian Yuzhmash in Dnepropetrovsk. The first stage engine was led by the Yuzhnoye Design Bureau together with the Bisk Altai. So even the missile itself is already cooperation across half the country, at least 4 regions. They tested it at first not from a combat submarine, of course. They took an old diesel-electric submarine, K-153 of Project 629, refitted it under a separate project, cut out part of the hull, installed one missile silo. And from there they fired mock-ups, plus a separate floating test stand, plus ground launches. All of this dragged on for years, because solid fuel on such a scale, I repeat, was being worked out here for the first time. There were failures too. which were openly discussed only in the 90s, when part of the archives cracked open. And the submarine itself at that time was being drawn by the Leningrad Rubin Design Bureau. And there was a man around whom, honestly, this whole story holds together: Sergei Nikitich Kovalyov. I want to say something about him separately because without this name, there would have been no Typhoon. Kovalyov, general designer of Soviet strategic missile submarines. Born in 1919 in Petrograd, Leningrad Shipbuilding Institute evacuation, finished his studies already in Nikolaev. From 43, at Rubin, then still TSKB-18. And from then on, right there, his whole life. 8 submarine projects under his leadership, 92 submarines built. When I read that figure, honestly, I sat down. 92. That's not a person, that's a factory of submarine cruisers and a single man. And in 71, he's assigned Project 941, the Akula, a heavy missile submarine cruiser of strategic designation, abbreviated TRPKSN, a tongue twister. Kovalyov was already no boy then, over 50, twice hero of socialist labor, laureate of the Lenin Prize. Everything achieved, everything received. He could, as they say, have worked in an easy mode. And they told him, "Here, you'll build the biggest in the world." And he took it on. There's a thought in his memoirs, later published already in our years by Rossiyskaya Gazeta and others. Not word for word, but in meaning, that from the very beginning they proposed making the Typhoon not just as a submarine, but as a unified system. Submarine, missile, shore base, infrastructure, all in one package with one schedule, with one financing. Hence the common name, Typhoon. A name, if you like, of a program, not of a single piece of hardware. And this, by the way, explains a lot of what we'll see later. So let's return to the submarine itself. Kovalyov and his people at Rubin looked at the dimensions of the missile and apparently understood a simple thing. Since the missile is so huge and there's no way to shrink it, then the submarine has to be not inflated from an old shape, but invented anew, from scratch, such that 20 missiles fit conveniently, that they can be launched in a salvo, that everything else fits around them: reactors, crew, torpedo armament, rescue systems, and that this whole structure can also dive, surface, travel under ice, and preferably quietly. 20 silos with R-39 missiles were placed in 2 rows. And what's interesting, not in the stern, as was usually done on other Soviet submarines, but ahead of the sail, right between the 2 main pressure hulls, like cargo in the hold of a huge catamaran. We'll talk about this arrangement separately in a minute. There's something to see there. And so when the drawings landed on the table, it turned out that this ship wouldn't even fit into an old boathouse. It wouldn't fit into any boathouse in the country. No one simply has one. No dimensions, no ceiling height, no cranes of suitable lifting capacity, nothing. And then, for this submarine, a separate workshop was built in Severodvinsk at Sevmash, workshop number 55. Later, it was renamed Boathouse number 2. But most veterans remember it precisely as the 55th, the largest covered single-span boathouse in the world for building submarines. On its roof, if you believe the references, you could fit 6 football fields. 6, not 1. Do you understand what scale it reached? To build a ship, you first have to build the house you'll assemble it in, and a house of such kind that it itself falls into the record category. But that's not all. Besides Sevmash itself, more than 1,000 enterprises across the Union took part in the project one way or another, from the Caspian to Vladivostok. Foundries, metallurgical, electrical, optical, instrument making, rubber goods, electronics, communications equipment, automation. By some counts, at Sevmash alone, more than 1,200 people who worked on the Akula received government awards. Not for one ship, for the series, but still a telling figure. One thing hooks me in this story. It's not only about the technology, it's about the scale of thinking. When a country sets a task to make the biggest weapon in the world, and for it in one place a special workshop is built, and in thousands of other places, special parts, that's no longer a project. That's a separate little economy. And all of it works for one ship, or rather, for a series of 6 ships. And this series was later even planned to be expanded to 10, and by the original plans all the way to 12. True, beyond the 6th it all went no further, but more on that later. And so by 76, the first hull was laid down in Workshop 55, factory number 711. More than 4 years later, in September 80, it was rolled out of the workshop and launched. Another year and a bit later, handed over to the fleet, the lead ship of the series, the one that would later get the name Dmitry Donskoy. We'll have a separate chapter about it in this video closer to the finale, because its fate turned out to be special. But for now, something else is important. What's important is that all this gigantism, 48,000 tons, 172 meters, the largest boathouse in the world, 1,000 factories, all of it grew not from a desire to make something big, but from a desire to carry underwater precisely this missile, R-39, and to launch it from where no one expects it. But here the next question appears, which honestly tormented me longer than all the others. Fine, the missile is enormous. Fine, 20 silos. But why then does the submarine have not one pressure hull, like all normal submarines, but 5 at once? And why of these 5, 2 main ones lie side by side like 2 barrels, and between them, a whole missile hold? This looks like nothing else. Not like American submarines, not like previous Soviet ones. And here I first thought it was a designer's whim, but it turned out not at all. Behind this scheme stands a very cold, very practical calculation. And it's connected not only with the missile, but with one peculiarity that the West had just then begun to suspect. The peculiarity is that the Typhoon is not one submarine. It is, strictly speaking, 5 submarines in one. 5 separate habitable pressure hulls, folded into a common steel casing. Like a matryoshka, only not by nesting but by arrangement, side by side. And at this point, honestly, all my familiar pictures of submarines fell apart. We usually imagine a submarine like this, one long cigar. Inside, one pressure hull, divided into compartments by bulkheads, all in a single line. The Typhoon? Not like that. Inside its common light hull, that same diving suit of steel, lie side by side 2 huge pressure hulls, maximum diameter up to 10 meters each, titanium alloy, 2 cylinders side by side, nearly the whole length of the submarine. By layout, like a classic catamaran. Only this catamaran hides underwater, and between them in the bow section, those same 20 silos with R-39 missiles in 2 rows of 10. A missile hold squeezed between 2 main hulls, like cargo between floats. And in addition to these 2 main ones, 3 more smaller pressure capsules, one at the front, where the torpedo compartment and the passage between the hulls are, one in the middle. There's the central post, from which the ship is controlled, and one in the stern, with machinery. That makes 5 habitable pressure hulls, and all of this on the outside is wrapped in a common steel shell of the light hull. It, by the way, is covered with a special rubber, anti-sonar and sound insulating. 800 tons of rubber alone. That is, the tire for the submarine was delivered by a separate factory. In total, this complex structure has 19 watertight compartments. 19. For comparison, most other Soviet submarines have 7 to 10. That's roughly twice the reserve for survivability. Between the 2 main hulls inside the submarine, there are 3 passages. One in the bow, one in the middle, and one in the stern. These are literally corridors connecting the 2 cylinders. For the crew to get from one half to the other, they had to pass through one of these capsules. Like an airlock between train cars, only cramped, titanium, and with sealed doors. Whoever served on the Typhoon knows these 3 passages like their own apartment. And here I have my first big question. Why such complexity? Why couldn't they make one thick pressure hull like everyone else and not suffer? The answers, I think, are hidden in 2 places, and both are curious. The first is about survivability. When you have 2 main hulls side by side, you, roughly speaking, spread the risks. Something happened to one circuit, the second stays intact. A breach, a fire, flooding. Half the ship keeps working. Designers later, already after the loss of the Kursk, said, not publicly but in interviews, that an explosion analogous to the one on the Kursk would not have been fatal for the Akula. I don't want to compare anything here, the topic is too heavy. We have a separate one about the Kursk, but the principle is clear. 2 hulls, 2 lines of defense, and along with this, 2 pop-up rescue chambers. They're hidden at the base of the sail, under the fairing of the retractable devices. So these chambers, if you believe the reference books, are designed for the entire crew as a whole. Not for part, not for half, but for everyone. This, for Soviet submarines, is a rarity, a unique thing. Another matter is that in reality, no one was ever seated in them in combat, and how it would have worked, we don't know and, I hope, won't find out. The second reason for this strange scheme is about buoyancy. And here begins the funniest part, and the most bitter one for the Akula. This submarine was disliked in the fleet. It has an unofficial nickname, water carrier. Not cruiser, not terror of the seas, but water carrier. And at the competing Leningrad design bureau, Malachit, they put it even more harshly, calling the project the victory of technology over common sense. For what, one might ask? Here's for what. The buoyancy reserve of the Typhoon is more than 40%. That's a lot. It means that submerged, about half of its enormous displacement, is not machinery, not missiles, not crew, but ordinary outboard water poured into tanks. Water that the submarine hauls on itself just to be able to submerge it all. Of the 48,000 tons, about 24,000 is ballast. Half the ship, water. Hence, water carrier, fleet irony, merciless and precise. By the ratio of how much it hauls on itself in total, how much useful payload with that, the Typhoon lost to the more modest Project 667 BDRM submarines. Those could carry nearly as many missiles, with half the displacement. The economics here were not in the Akula's favor. Then why? Why like that? The answer, in short, is because of 2 things: ice and shore. The first is ice. The project was designed for work in the Arctic. The task was to be able to sit under the ice and from there, from under the ice, if necessary, carry out a missile salvo. And for this, the submarine must be able to surface not in open water, but through the icy cover. That is, to break through the ice. And here everything comes in handy at once. A large buoyancy reserve is effectively a reserve of force with which the ship surfaces. It doesn't just pop up, it heaves upward. Plus, the sail. The Typhoon's sail fairing is made especially strong. It's designed to break through ice up to 2.5 meters thick. For understanding, the thickness of ice in the Arctic Ocean in winter is usually from 1 meter 20 to 2 meters. In some places, right around 2.5. That is, the submarine was designed with a margin for the toughest conditions. And there's another detail there that I really like. From below, Arctic ice is not smooth like a skating rink. From below it has growths, stalactites, buildups. Such an icy fringe that can seriously damage the hull if you hit it by accident. So you have to surface not only forcefully, but also in the right place. The crew had to find gaps, leads, thinner polonias, and break through precisely there. A whole science. The second reason for the large buoyancy reserve is far more prosaic. The shore, or rather, the bases. You see, the Americans, when they built their Ohios, built special new bases for them too. With us, though, it was customary to save on infrastructure. Existing piers, existing repair yards, existing channels leading to the workshops. And the designers were given a strict requirement. The draft of the new ship on the surface must be small, such that the Akula could enter its old base and moor at existing piers, not to build a new country for the submarine, but to fit the submarine to the old country. How to ensure this? The only way, to make the hull wide and not sitting very deep in the water, and to compensate the difference with ballast. Let it submerge by pouring into itself half its own weight in water. And so they did. Honestly, what hooked me is this. The largest submarine in human history is in a certain sense a child of compromise. On one side, the missile, which dictated the size. On the other, the old shore infrastructure, which didn't want to change for the new weapon. In between these two walls, the designers had to find a gap. They found it, but at the cost of this water carrier. And so when this whole behemoth with 2 main hulls, 20 missiles, titanium capsules inside, 800 tons of rubber outside, when all of this is finally assembled and launched, people come aboard. And there are, if you count by the staffing table, only 160 of them. Of them, 52 officers. The rest, warrant officers, petty officers, sailors. 160. On a ship the size of a 9-story building with 5 entrances, the length of 2 football fields. Compared to an ordinary submarine, where per square meter, shoulder to shoulder, here people suddenly have a lot of space. And you know what's interesting? On the Typhoon, the commander held the rank not of captain first rank, like on other Soviet strategic submarines, but of rear admiral. That is, by formal criterion, this is no longer just a submarine. It's a flotation, a floating headquarters. Separately, by the way, this was much discussed in the fleet, and not always with enthusiasm, because there aren't many admiral positions, and the Typhoons, so to speak, held them for themselves. But that's a separate story. We'll come back to it. And so, imagine, here's where everything else appears. The thing for which this submarine was then dubbed the underwater city in the Western press. The question is how true that is. Is it true that inside there was a swimming pool, a sauna, a gym, and a living corner? Or is this another legend? Or after all, yes, all of it existed, but in some very particular, very Soviet sense. When I dug into it, I expected to find that this was a nice exaggeration. It turned out, not quite. The swimming pool, 4 meters by 2. Depth, 2. Freshwater, or if you like, outboard, salty. Heated. Right on a combat missile cruiser in the middle of the Arctic Ocean at a depth of 200 meters. Not a legend. It's in reference books, in drawings, in sailors' memoirs. It existed, truly. When I first read this, honestly, doubt took me. What swimming pool on a submarine where every kilogram of weight, every cubic meter of volume, every liter of fresh water counts? I went to double check. And it turned out it really does exist and is confirmed in several independent sources at once, including specialized fleet reference books. And not only the pool, look, a sauna, paneled with oak boards, designed for 5. By the recollections of those who served, of course more crammed in there, up to a dozen. The sailor's soul takes its due. The oak, by the way, was delivered separately. You can't put just any wood in a steam room. Further, a solarium, a recreation lounge, a gym, a living corner, that is, a small corner with greenery, and by some recollections, with fish in an aquarium and even a bird. The exact makeup of this menagerie diverges in different sources, so here I'll tell you honestly, there's little specifics, but the very fact of a living corner is confirmed. And perhaps the most unusual, on the Typhoon there was a separate cabin for smoking, a separate room where you could calmly, without strain, take a cigarette, not worrying about ventilation or a neighbor or a reprimand. By reports, no other submarine in the world had such a cabin, not one. This, if you think about it, is downright funny, but also very Soviet. They thought about the person who smokes, didn't forbid it, but set aside a corner for him. Add to this 2 wardrooms, separately for officers, separately for warrant officers and sailors. 2 and 4 berth cabins for the command staff, with wash basins, with televisions, with air conditioning. For the enlisted, small berthing quarters, but again, not the 5-star hell of other Soviet submarines, where they slept in shifts on a single bunk. In the fleet, the Akulas for all this were called the floating Hilton. There's such an expression, it's circulated both in sailors' memoirs and in the late Soviet press. Floating Hilton. By the Soviet hierarchy of comfort, this is of course almost mockery because a real Hilton none of the submariners had ever laid eyes on. But for lack of a better comparison, it stuck. And now, a question, which honestly hooked me the most. Why all this? Why does a combat nuclear missile submarine need a swimming pool? Why does it need a solarium? Is it a sanatorium? And here the answer becomes, in my view, the most interesting part of this whole story. Because comfort on the Typhoon is not a gift, not a whim of the designers, and not the merit of admirals. It's a function, part of the combat mission. The same kind of element of armament as a missile in a silo or a sonar complex in the bow. Look, the endurance of the Akula is 180 days, 6 months, half a year. That's how long the submarine can theoretically spend underwater without surfacing, without replenishing supplies, without communication with the shore in the usual sense. In different sources, true, you also find the figure of 120 days. It relates to other regimes and standard patrol norms. But the design limit is 180, half a year, without sun, without fresh air, without a view out a window, because there are no windows at all, without family, with the same set of people you see 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with artificial light, with the noise of machinery, with the smell of iron, machine oil, and, if we're being completely honest, 160 unwashed men, whatever they say about filters and air conditioners, half a year in an iron pipe, at sea, under the ice. So you understand what this means physically. The crew has no day in the usual sense. There's ship's time. Everyone lives by it. The light in the compartments is switched to day and night. They just adjust the lighting because otherwise the body loses its rhythm completely. Watches run every 4 hours. 4 hours on, 8 resting and sleeping, then back on post. Not a single cell of your brain remembers what day of the week it is. That's erased from your head within a week of the patrol. The calendar is only in the wardroom and in the executive officer's schedule, nowhere else. And when you start seriously thinking about this, it becomes clear. The sauna, the pool, the solarium, the living corner are not luxury. They're, if you like, medicine, psychological. Prevention of what in military language is called asthenoneurotic syndrome of a long patrol, and in human terms, quiet madness. People in a confined space for 6 months straight start cutting each other with their glances, start snapping, start getting sick for no visible reason. Give it a like if you didn't know that inside a combat nuclear submarine, there was a real swimming pool. That way, more people will see this video. About this, by the way, the general designer of the Akula, Sergei Nikitich Kovalyov, whom we already talked about in the last chapter, wrote directly, not a word-for-word quote, but in meaning. The crew on a strategic designation ship is part of the weapon system. If a person breaks down over 6 months, the whole system worth billions of rubles loses its meaning. So it's necessary that he not break down. And for that you need not only rations and ventilation, you need the chance to exhale, to spend time in the warmth of steam, to lie under an artificial sun, to flop into a small pool after a hard shift, even just to go smoke in a separate corner and bother no one there. Hence, the living corner. Something living, green, at least something other than metal. On the American Ohios, by the way, they also attended to the crew's living conditions, but such a set of luxury as on the Akula, by most sources they didn't have. Ours came out broader, partly because the submarine itself was broader. There's another thing important here which we rarely recall. By the time the Typhoon was built, the Soviet Union already had a very serious school of naval medicine and shipboard psychology. Our submariners, starting back in the 60s, regularly went on very long patrols, on Hiroshimas, on Urshas, on diesels and nuclear boats. And military doctors accumulated statistics. What happens to a person in the 3rd month, the 4th, the 5th? When insomnia begins, when conflicts, when hysteria in the calmest ones. And it was to these submariner statistics that the living conditions of the Akula were designed. These aren't pleasant little things out of generosity. They're, if you like, engineers' answer to a concrete medical diagnosis. One of those who later, already in the 2000s, commanded the lead ship, the Dmitry Donskoy, Captain First Rank Oleg Tsibin. In an interview with the Russian press, he recounted, "Over a patrol, the crew manages to watch plenty of films, reread books, play plenty of chess, and visit the pool. And still by the end of the patrol, people come out wrung dry, not physically, mentally." That line honestly stayed in my head the longest. Even with a pool, wrung dry. And in this lies the solution to the myth of the underwater city. On one hand, yes, all of this really was on the Typhoon. Swimming pool, sauna, solarium, living corner, smoking cabin. These aren't tall tales, it's a confirmed fact, recorded in reference books and in the recollections of those who served. On the other, city is, of course, a metaphor. A beautiful, striking, slightly newspapery one, but a metaphor. There was no city there. It was still that same cramped combat machine, packed with mechanisms, cables, silos, torpedoes, with half the hull filled with ballast water, with people who sit in iron for 6 months and don't see the sky. It's just that inside this machine, some of the designers and doctors seriously thought about the fact that these people need somewhere to live. What hooked me in this story is not the number of amenities, and not even the pool. What hooked me is that on the largest weapon in human history, they found room for an aquarium with fish, and for an oak steam room, and for a room where you can silently have a smoke. This is, if you like, a very human contradiction. The same submarine with one hand carried 200 nuclear warheads, and with the other, heated water for someone in a little 4x2 bath. But there's another side to this story too. Half a year is not only about living conditions, it's also about where exactly the crew spent those 6 months, where the ship stood, what it did, where it went. About the combat patrols of the Typhoons, in my view, maybe 10% of what actually happened has been told. And here a layer opens up that honestly won't let me go. The thing is, these submarines were built not to show themselves off at parades. They were built for one very specific theater. And this theater was not somewhere in warm waters, not in the Atlantic, not in the Mediterranean. The theater is the Arctic. The Arctic Ocean, the near polar latitudes, that very icy cover that for the rest of the world's submarines is almost a forbidden zone, and for the Typhoon, a workplace, a duty station. Like for an ordinary ship, a watch off the shore. And now the picture. 300 meters of depth. Overhead, a meter or 2 meter layer of ice. For thousands of miles. Nothing living, only silence. The noise of underwater currents and the clicks of orcas somewhere far to the south. And there, in this silence, stands a ship the size of a 9-story building, with 20 missiles and silos, with 200 nuclear warheads, and it waits for one single signal. This was what the West feared. Not the size in itself, not the pool inside, not the Guinness record, but the very idea, the very scheme of employment, a weapon that sits where it can't be reached. You know what general designer Kovalyov wrote about this? In those same memoirs we already mentioned. In his words, the task sounded directly. To extend the combat employment zone of the new ship under the Arctic ice all the way to the pole. And note, beyond the pole. Beyond. That is, the ship had to be able to work not only in our northern seas, but to go under the polar cap straight through if need be. To the shores of Canada. To Greenland. To the coast of Alaska, if you like. It was precisely from these areas that the range of the R-39 missiles, about 8,000 kilometers, covered practically the entire territory of the potential adversary. And the warhead, up to 10 independent blocks, 20 missiles, 200 targets. And now the most important thing. All of this was done covertly. Look, an ordinary Soviet missile submarine, and before the Akula there were many, from the Urships to those same 667s, could also go into the Arctic, could also dive under the ice. But to launch a missile, it had to come out into open water, find a polynya, or break the ice before launch. That is, come out from under the ice. That is, crudely put, appear on the surface, which meant getting spotted, giving away its position to acousticians, radars, satellites, a chance reconnaissance plane. After that, they'd already try to intercept the submarine or disrupt the launch. The Typhoon, by design, was supposed to remove this limitation. It could surface in the ice, not searching for open water, but precisely breaking through the ice ceiling. Its sail fairing was made to withstand ice up to 2.5 meters thick. The submarine surfaces in a clever way. The bow planes are retracted. The ship slowly, carefully rises toward the ice, presses its specially reinforced bow and sail against the icy ceiling as if it butted into the roof from below, and a sharp blowing of the main ballast tanks. The huge buoyancy reserve we talked about acts like a hydraulic press. The hull climbs upward, the ice cracks, splits, and the sail comes out into the open. By the recollections of those who did this, and such accounts exist, including in specialized publications, the process is not festive at all. In May '98, there was a separate experimental patrol where they worked out precisely the limits of this capability. They started with meter-thick ice. reached 2 meters easily, surfaced even through 2.5. Once they surfaced very slowly, the hull creaked, something cracked. Then it turned out that from the load, the plastic fairings were dented, the silo covers were bent, the sail fairing deformed. But they surfaced, so it works. Here, by the way, I want to make an honest caveat. In the popular press, you sometimes find a more striking version, that the Typhoon could fire straight from under the ice, without surfacing. That before the missile, special projectiles first went out and broke the ice, and only after them the R-39s launched. Sounds beautiful. But in specialized sources, this is more often described differently. The standard scenario: first break through the ice with the sail, surface, and only then fire. There are authors who write directly, from under the ice, the Akula could not fire missiles. How it actually was in different versions of the project and in different instructions is not fully declassified. I'll leave this as an open item. If any of you who are in the know have exact data, write in the comments. We'll go over it separately. But this doesn't really change the principle. To stand watch under the ice, the Akula could. To surface in the ice, could. To fire from near polar regions, could. And this in itself is already a nightmare for American anti-submarine defense. Because American ASW strategy back then was built on what? On a system of stationary hydrophones on the bottom of the Atlantic and Pacific? SOSUS, there's such a thing. Sound Surveillance System, a network of underwater microphones that track the noise of our submarines. On patrol aviation, Orion planes dropping buoys. On their own hunter submarines, which trailed our strategic boats and kept them in their sights from base all the way to the patrol area. All these tools worked well in the warm Atlantic, in the open ocean, where the environment is predictable, and the submarine, if anything, goes along standard routes. But in the Arctic, they didn't work. The Americans themselves considered navigating in shallow water under the ice of the Arctic seas a very risky business. Their Ohios, as a rule, didn't go under the ice. Their hunter submarines, also far from always. And so when the Akula goes to the pole, there's simply no one there to meet it. And you know what else is telling here? For these long polar patrols, the Typhoons had a separate technique worked out. Each ship was allotted not one crew, but several, 2 combat and 1 technical. The shifts changed when the submarine returned to base. And on high-latitude patrols, when returning was far and long, the crews were changed right at sea. An icebreaker came, the submarine surfaced in the ice, the crews, as they say, swapped. One went down, the other came up, and the ship stayed on duty further. One such patrol was carried out in 1987 by TK-12 Simbirsk, a long, high-latitude one, with repeated crew changes. Not 40 days, not 2 months, much longer. About this patrol, for understandable reasons, very little is known. But the very fact of such a way of serving speaks louder than any specifications. A weapon that lives underwater for months and changes people without coming out from under the ice. This is no longer a submarine. This is combat duty of an underwater garrison. And here's a second thing: low noise. The Typhoon, for all its enormity, in acoustics was the quietest Soviet strategic submarine at the time of construction. Only later projects were quieter. It has 2-stage rubber-cored pneumatic shock absorption. Simply put, the mechanisms inside the submarine sit not rigidly on the hull, but through rubber dampers, through air cushions. Plus a modular layout, reactors, turbines, and everything that hums and shakes, assembled into separate blocks, each of which is itself on shock absorbers. And around all of this, 800 tons of special rubber coating on the hull. Outwardly, a rubber skin. It dampens both its own noise and the reflected signal of the enemy's sonar. Simply put, the Typhoon sounded underwater not like a giant metal house, but like something much more modest. Plus, the background noise of the Arctic. The cracking of ice, the movement of underwater currents, the noise of ice masses against each other. All of this is, if you like, natural camouflage. In such conditions, searching for a specific submarine is almost hopeless. Add to this one more property that the Soviet and then the Russian press actively circulated: that the Typhoon is impossible to detect from space. The thesis is this: due to design features, due to the buoyancy and the depths it travels at, Satellite reconnaissance means can't get it. I'll be honest, this is more of a claimed property than a strict fact. Satellite reconnaissance of that time had very limited capabilities against underwater targets in general. So here I personally soften the wording. The Typhoon was an extremely difficult target for space reconnaissance. But absolute invisibility doesn't exist in nature. And so when all of this comes together, a long autonomous patrol, half a year underwater, duty right under the ice of the polar cap, the ability to surface in the ice for a launch, silence, the huge range of the missile, and 200 warheads in a single salvo, you get exactly the machine that Western publications called the Doomsday Weapon. Not for the size, not for the pool, but for the fact that it can't be guaranteed to be destroyed in a first strike. Which means there's no point in even starting. This, if you think about it, is the very meaning of strategic nuclear deterrence. A weapon is valuable not because it fires, but because all sides understand it will definitely fire in response. And the Akula stood at the most vulnerable point of this calculation for the adversary. So the West's fear was quite real. Not invented by journalists, not inflated for the papers, real. And honestly, what amazes me is not the fact of this fear itself. What amazes me is something else. How? With all the secrecy, with the classified appearance of the ship, with the enclosed boathouse, with internal counterintelligence, the West found out at all what this submarine looked like. How it got the photos, how it gathered the characteristics. The world started talking about the Typhoon program even before the first serial ship came out the workshop gates. And here, a completely different story begins, resembling no longer a military report, but a spy novel. The name Typhoon is a trap, specially built, specially launched, and it was thought up personally by the General Secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev. The 23rd of February 1981, Moscow, the Kremlin, the Great Hall of Meetings. The 26th Congress of the CPSU, 5,000 delegates, representatives of 109 foreign parties, red banners, carpet runners, a picture familiar from childhood. Brezhnev at the podium reads the accountability report. And at some point, amid discussions of the international situation and the arms race, he utters a phrase that had never officially sounded anywhere before. Verbatim, by the transcript, he says roughly this: "The Americans have created a new submarine, Ohio, with Trident missiles. An analogous system, Typhoon, is available to us as well." And this one phrase, uttered from the Congress podium, lands in all the world's newspapers. It's caught by the Associated Press, Reuters, the New York Times, Le Monde, Jane's Defense. Every translator, every military commentator, every CIA analyst puts one word in his notebook: Typhoon. What is it? A program? A missile? A submarine? No one fully understands, and they start to speculate. What hooked me in this story is this. By the official version, which circulates in both our and Western sources, Brezhnev uttered this word deliberately to mislead the adversary. The real name of the project was completely different. Project 941. Cipher. Akula. That's what it was called in drawings, in orders, in ministerial papers. That's what it was called at the Rubin Design Bureau and at Sevmash. And Typhoon is, in essence, a nickname stuck on top to confuse anyone who tries to dig up the program itself by its name. And the trick, worked. Even now, 40 years later, most people around the world, including, honestly, a huge portion of Russian readers, know this submarine as the Typhoon. The real name, Akula. It faded into the background, and on top there remained a propaganda decoy. Though there's a subtlety here. There's a separate version, voiced already in our years by an American military expert, citing his sources. By it turns out that the United States learned about the Soviet Typhoon project even earlier, in '74, when Brezhnev allegedly told then U.S. President Gerald Ford, "If you insist on your Trident program, then we'll build Typhoon." How accurate this is a question. I haven't come across the original source of this phrase in our open press, but suppose the hint really did sound. Then it turns out even more interesting. Soviet disinformation was working not from '81, but from '74, from the very earliest stage of design. That is, the adversary was given a word, and under this word he drew in his own head some abstract typhoon that had nothing to do with the real Akula. And against the backdrop of these verbal maneuvers runs a second line, the line of real secrecy. Not propaganda, but real. Look, boathouse number 55, the one we already recalled, is covered. That is, from a plane, from a satellite, from the sea, you see only walls and a roof. What's inside? You can't tell. Sevmash Predpriятие itself is closed, huge, worked under a code designation. In the West, it was known as the Yegorov firm, after the surname of one of its directors, not as a factory, but as some vague enterprise. Severodvinsk, a closed city, outsiders not allowed. The Kola Peninsula, a completely closed zone of the Northern Fleet. Nerpitya Bay, where the 18th Division was based, all the more so. Sentries, passes, stamps, a second line of fencing, a third. Inside the ship itself, also layers. There sat people who knew the whole project. Such were few. Kovalyov, the Rubin designers, the factory director, the ship's commander. Beyond that, those who knew their compartment, their system, their sector. The warrant officer responsible for ventilation didn't know missile matters. The missile man didn't know the reactor arrangement at the level of schematics. That's how the Soviet principle of know only what you're supposed to know worked. And this principle, honestly, worked pretty well. But with all this, secrecy has one vulnerable spot. And it, as always, is the human being. There's an episode in this story I can't help but tell, because it goes from source to source, from book to book, from article to article, and yet in no place does it have a strict document. A classic urban legend of the Soviet defense complex. But it is very characteristic. Listen. Somewhere in the early 80s, shortly after the first Typhoon, the lead TK-208, the future Dmitry Donskoy, came out the boathouse gates, a photo of this submarine in the handover dock ended up in the British magazine Jane's Defense. This, for those who don't know, is the most authoritative publication in the world on military hardware. They still publish the characteristics of all significant weapons there. And suddenly a photograph of the Soviet nuclear giant appears there, the exact shape, the exact length, with the sail, with the outlines of the hull. A scandal, to put it mildly, a first-category leak. Then comes the oral tradition. By it, the photo was allegedly taken by one of the factory's workers. By various retellings, a crane operator at Sevmash, who worked in that very boathouse. Just a woman who climbed up into her crane cab and snapped the giant standing below. The KGB, if you believe the retelling, then figured her out by one feature, by the angle of the shot. The reasoning was roughly this. From the ground, from deck level, from the surface side, you can't shoot this submarine that way. The view isn't right. And from that height and that angle, only a person sitting in the cab of a specific crane could see it. The circle narrowed to one workshop, one shift, one cab. Again, I emphasize, this is oral tradition, this is a retelling. Neither a name, nor a date, nor a case number is given in the sources. Not a single document surfaced. Maybe it was exactly so, maybe half so. Maybe there was no specific crane operator at all, but a chain of leaks through several people, and in the popular retelling it got compressed into one dramatic figure. We don't know this for sure. But you know what's interesting here? Is the very structure of this legend. It speaks of layers of witnesses. There are people who saw the ship from the inside, the crew. Interrogating them was pointless. They passed selection. They took an oath. Others vouched for them. There are the Rubin engineers. They were known by face. They were under lifelong observation. There's the high military command, a level higher still. And there's the auxiliary personnel, crane operators, cleaners, outside welders, subcontractors, electricians, people who happen to be near a secret simply because their work was physically near it. This layer is always the most vulnerable, and interestingly, the most poorly interviewed, because the authorities seem to forget about it. And in vain. Have you heard the story before about the photo from the dock and the crane operator? Write in the comments whether you believe it or think it's a beautiful legend. I'm curious myself where this version turned up more often, in our sources or in Western ones. There's one more detail in this line that honestly stung me. The first Akula, the lead TK-208, when it was still being built in the boathouse, had a picture painted on its bow section below the waterline. An ordinary painting, a snarling shark coiling around a trident, such a crude, artisanal, sailor's one, by tradition, for luck. After the ship was launched, this shark was forever hidden by the waterline. No one ever saw it again. But precisely because of it, by legend, the fleet dubbed the submarine Akula, shark. And then the same shark was painted on the patches of the crews of all 6 ships of the series. So the project got its second, semi-official name, from below, from the people, not from the command. And in all this lies the paradox of the whole story with the names. The real name, Akula, was born from a shark that only the builders and the first sailors saw, from a picture that after the launch no one would ever see again. And the false name, Typhoon, was born from a single word uttered from a podium to the whole world. And the first one. Below in the closed workshops, Akula. Above in the press and books, Typhoon. 2 names, 2 layers. And against this backdrop, at that very moment, when Soviet counterintelligence is trying to close leaks to British magazines, and Brezhnev from the Congress podium throws the adversary a verbal bait. Across the ocean, in one quiet American town in the state of Maryland, sits a man no one knows. He's not a soldier, not an intelligence officer, not a journalist. He's an insurance agent, sells policies, works with papers, and in his free time, reads magazines about military hardware. All of them. Specialized publications, reference books, articles about submarines. And at some point, this insurance agent, who didn't have a single security clearance in any country in the world, sits down and starts writing a novel. A novel about a Soviet submarine, huge, missile-carrying, heading west. Thus, Red October would come into the world. A book because of which millions of people around the world learn about the Soviet nuclear giants. And imagine, learn at the very moment when the KGB in Severodvinsk is chasing real photo leaks. The novel, The Hunt for Red October, was written by a man who had never been on a single submarine. Not American, not Soviet, never in his life. Not on a tour, not once. His name was Tom Clancy. Full name, Thomas Leo Clancy Jr. An ordinary American born 1947 from the town of Owings, Maryland. As a child, he dreamed of being a tankman. Then he wanted to go fight in Vietnam. But he had such poor eyesight that the Army didn't take him, only reserve officer courses, and that's all. After that, he tried writing science fiction. It didn't work out. No one wanted to publish it. And then, to feed his family, he took a job as an insurance agent, sold policies. And this insurance agent, who didn't have a single military clearance in any country in the world, started writing a novel in his free time about a Soviet nuclear missile submarine of the Typhoon class, which heads west with its entire crew and with a revolutionary silent propulsion system aboard. It heads off, and they try to find it, both the Soviets and the Americans, but each with their own aims. The novel came out in 1984 through the Naval Institute Press. This is, simply put, the publishing house attached to the American Naval Academy attached to the Navy. And an interesting detail, this is the only work of fiction that this publisher put out in its entire history. Usually they print reference books, monographs, regulations, and here suddenly, a novel by an obscure insurance agent about a Soviet submarine. So someone there in the academy, having read the manuscript, said, "This should be published. This is plausible. This is worth attention." And it turned out that it was worth it. The novel exploded. #1 on the bestseller lists, million-copy print runs, translations into dozens of languages, and in 1990, a film. Director John McTiernan. The role of the defector Captain Marco Ramius is played by Sean Connery. That very one, from James Bond. In the role of the American CIA analyst, a young Alec Baldwin, an Oscar for Best Sound Editing. And from this moment, millions of people around the world, including the Soviet Union, saw the Typhoon, or rather, the fictional Red October of the Typhoon type, as Clancy understood it. And now, a very important question. How much is this what really was? Let's break it down by layers. What Clancy got right and what was invented. This is, if you like, our signature work of myth-breaking. Here's what matched. The name Typhoon matched. As we already said, by 1984 it had been circulating in the Western press since the Congress for 3 years. 20 missiles with nuclear warheads matched. The giant dimensions, the catamaran of 2 pressure hulls, matched. The Northern Fleet as the basing location, matched. Duty under the ice, matched. Even some details of daily life matched. The comfort, the cabins for officers with individual amenities, the wardrobe. On all these points, Clancy hit the mark. How did he do it? Here's the most interesting part. He had no clearance. He got into not a single Soviet port. He read open sources, that same Jane's Defense, naval magazines, analytical reviews. He dissected bit by bit everything that appeared in the West about the Soviet submarine fleet. And, apparently, at the very least consulted with people at the academy where his book was published. That is, with American naval officers. How much they told him what they knew professionally is an open question. Clancy never spoke about it directly, but the general impression among professionals was too good for just an insurance man. And here's what was invented. First, the very existence of the submarine Red October. There was no such submarine in the Soviet fleet. Moreover, Soviet submarines in general didn't have personal names in the form that surface ships did. There were indexes, TK-208, TK-202, TK-12. Names, Dmitry Donskoy, Severstal, Arkhangelsk, began to be given later, already in the times of perestroika and in the 2000s. And this, by the way, to any Soviet reader even slightly familiar with the fleet, was obvious from the first page. Second, the main character, Marko Ramius, a Lithuanian by nationality, commander of that same Red October. He takes the submarine west because he has personal scores to settle with Soviet power. But in Clancy, Ramius is Marko, and Lithuanian male names as a rule end in S. Marko is more of an Italian name. No Lithuanian would call himself that. A classic American mistake. Made the hero ethnic, but didn't figure out exactly what ethnicity. By the way, an interesting detail. It's believed that as the prototype for Ramius, at least in part, Clancy took a real Soviet officer, Valery Sablin, that same one who in '75 raised a mutiny on the large anti-submarine ship Storozhevoy in the Baltic. Only Sablin wasn't going to flee anywhere. On the contrary, he wanted to address the Soviet people with political demands. For this, he was later shot. The story is tragic and very complicated. We may have a separate video about it. If you're interested, write. But Clancy flipped this story. In his, the officer flees west. A completely different motive. The third thing that was invented is the caterpillar. In the novel, the Red October has a revolutionary silent propulsion system, a magneto-hydrodynamic drive, working on the principle of pumping water through an electromagnetic field. Because of it, the submarine becomes practically inaudible to sonar. And it's precisely for this system that the entire American fleet wants to steal and capture it. So then, there was never any caterpillar on the real Typhoons. There was rubber cord shock absorption, which we already talked about. There was anti-sonar coating. There was a modular layout. That is, acoustic stealth, but by ordinary technical means, not thanks to some fantastic drive. Magneto-hydrodynamic engines exist in reality. The Japanese even tested them on a surface ship in the 90s, but the result turned out very mediocre. On submarines, they were never applied. And now, the open question that I promised and that honestly still won't let me go. Clancy wrote his novel in '83, '84. At that time, the lead TK-208 had only just entered service. Its appearance was classified. There were essentially no real photographs in the Western press, except for that same disputed shot from Jane's Defense. And here's the question. How much did Clancy really understand what exactly he was describing? How much of his Red October is a literary guess, and how much something more? You can't answer directly. Clancy said until the end of his life that he wrote based on open sources. He was believed and not believed. Some American military men later half-jokingly recounted that in certain scenes, Clancy hit closer than his clearances allowed. How true this is can't be proven. How much it's a beautiful legend that the sailors themselves like to retell over whiskey, also. Maybe all of it together. I'd ask you to hold this uncertainty in your head. This is exactly the case where an honest mystery is better than an invented one. We don't know where exactly Clancy got what he got, and perhaps we never will. Part of the CIA archives on this episode is not open to this day. And you know what in this whole story is, in my view, the most bitter? Or the most ironic, depending on how you look at it. While Clancy was writing his novel, while Hollywood was filming the movie, while millions of Americans fell asleep imagining the silent Red October creeping under the ice, the real typhoons at that time were doing their work, quietly, without pools on the poster, without Sean Connery in the sail. They went on high-latitude patrols, changed crews at sea, lay down on the bottom off shores that even we, at home in our own country, don't really know about. Blew up training missiles in the silos and still returned to base. About their real service, about these 6 ships, publicly told in my view, maybe 10%. Well, maybe 15. Everything else is either still classified or already lost along with the people who could have told it. And here I want to ask one question, a simple one. What really happened in those patrols about which there isn't a line now in the open press? Who was there? Who survived? Who didn't come back? The answers are not in Clancy's novel. The answers, if they exist anywhere, are in the archives of the Northern Fleet, in the files of the 18th Division, and in the memory of the submariners themselves, who grow fewer every year. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Next is precisely about what happened with the real Akulas, not the movie ones, about their patrols, their emergencies, and about one episode that for a very long time people tried not to recall aloud. The 27th of September, 1991. The White Sea. Aboard the heavy nuclear cruiser TK-17, Arkhangelsk. Pre-launch preparation is underway for a planned missile launch at a coastal test range. Commander, Captain First Rank Igor Grishkov. Everything by the textbook. They came out to the designated point, took the required depth, 1900 hours. The countdown begins. And in the last seconds of launch, the automatics abort the launch. Something's wrong. The missile stays in the silo. And a moment later, the crew feels several impacts. Not from outside, from inside, from the missile compartment. The training missile, and its weight, I remind you, is about 90 tons, catches fire in the silo and burns. By an amazing stroke of luck, the entire missile hold on the Typhoon is arranged not like on other submarines, between the 2 main pressure hulls, isolated. And the designers, when they drew this complex scheme in the 70s, built precisely this scenario into it, so that even an explosion of a missile in a silo wouldn't tear the submarine in half. That's what Kovalyov wrote in his memoirs, in plain text. And so in 91, this scheme worked. The crew is alive. The ship is not lost. But the incident is severe, and until recently they preferred not to talk about it more than necessary. What hooks me in this story is also the date, the 27th of September, 91. In 8 days, the Soviet Union formally still existed. The collapse would begin in December. But in fact, it was already going. And against the backdrop of this going, the last, so to speak, major emergency of the Soviet era on a typhoon, like a symbol, the empire still fires, but already falters. About the real patrols of these 6 ships, we know less than we'd like. But something is known for certain, and I want to go over it by name. 6 ships, all the 18th Submarine Division of the Northern Fleet, Nerpichya Bay, Zapadnaya Litsa. The first, TK-208, the lead. Later it would get the name Dmitry Donskoy. We have a separate chapter about it ahead, because its fate is a separate plot. For now, just remember, laid down in 76, launched in 80, in service from 81. The only one of the 6 that lives to this day, even if laid up. The second, TK-202. Entered service in 83, served exactly until 99. Then it was the first of the Akulas sent for disposal, quietly, without fanfare. The third, TK-12, Simbirsk. This is the one we already recalled when we talked about the Arctic. In 1987, it carried out a long, high-latitude patrol, with repeated crew changes right at sea. An icebreaker came. The submarine surfaced, one crew went down, another came up. About this patrol in open sources, a handful of lines. No exact dates. No route. No surnames except the commanders. All we know is that it happened, and that it was long. The fourth, TK-13, entered service in '85. An ordinary, so to speak, combat missile carrier. Duties, patrols, repairs, decommissioned in the 2000s. The fifth, TK-17, Arkhangelsk, that very one our conversation began with. It was precisely on it that in September '91, that incident with the training missile happened, plus an interesting detail. In later years, when there was no longer the USSR nor the R-39 series, this submarine's missile silos were cut out, and it was left standing that way at the pier. By one curious account, so that an American satellite flying over Severodvinsk could clearly see no silos, no weapon, no threat. That is, the ship was turned into a message addressed to the adversary, just by its outward appearance. The sixth, TK-20, Severstal, commissioned in '89, the youngest of the series. Last combat duty, 2002. Beyond that, reserve. It was planned to build, if you recall, 12, then 10, then 7. In reality, 6 were built. The 7th hull they managed to start. Metal, structures, equipment were being prepared for it. But in '91, the factory was told, stop. The project is being closed. The started hull was in the end dismantled right on the slipway in Severodvinsk. Cut up. What hadn't even become a ship yet went to scrap. What hooks me most in the story of the 6 Akulas is one common detail. They weren't liked. Directly, frankly, in the fleet, they weren't liked. About the nickname water carrier, we already spoke. But there was something else too. By the ratio of how much the ship weighs, how much useful payload it carries, the Typhoon lost to the more modest nuclear missile carriers of the previous project. Project 667BDRM, Delphine by our classification. It was half the size and displacement, and carried nearly as many missiles. And importantly, these missiles were liquid fuel, compact, mastered by industry, not the bulky, expensive, experimental R-39, which was made at the limit of technology. The economics of the Typhoon, to put it dryly, didn't add up. It was more expensive to build, more expensive to operate, required special shore infrastructure, a special transport missile carrier, Alexander Brykin, of Project 11570, just to haul missiles to the pier. One such transport could take only 16 missiles, and the ship carried 20. That's already, if you like, a warning bell. The submarine's load didn't fit into the standard supply scheme. And a second grievance, a fleet one, no longer about technology, about people. On all previous Soviet strategic submarines, the ship's commander was a captain first rank. On the Typhoon, a rear admiral. That is, by one staff position, one submarine took an admiral's vacancy from the rest of the fleet. And the fleet is very sensitive to such things. One thing, a unique project. Another, when behind it stands the distribution of ranks, salaries, benefits, and most importantly, career prospects. And so when all of this overlaps, technical complexity, economic burden, personnel jealousy, you get a pattern. A country has a super weapon, unique, without analogs, but the country itself seems burdened by it. Doesn't praise it to the whole world, doesn't build a cult around it like the Americans around the Ohio. On the contrary, hides it, curses it behind closed doors, tolerates it, and waits for a chance to get rid of it. And note, this is not a post-Soviet story. This is already the late '80s. Complaints about the Typhoon sounded from inside the system long before everything went sliding. There are open publications in the military press of 1991, 2000, where officers, the same Rear Admiral Kostev with his son, put the question directly: is the gigantism justified? Did we invest correctly in this project? Didn't one Typhoon eat up 5 Delphins? And you know what's most bitter here? While they argued in articles, the country itself was already gone. The argument was about an inheritance that no longer belonged to anyone. And on this note, I want to tear you away from the history of the submarines themselves for a minute and ask for one thing. If you've watched to this point, please give a like. That way more people will see this video, and you and I don't have to go into the recommendations through chance. And in the comments, write, have you heard about that episode with the burning missile in the silo of the Arkhangelsk in September '91? In our Soviet press back then, they practically didn't talk about it. I'm curious where people learned about it, from family, from recollections, from later books. And now, the most important turn. The whole video we talk about technology, about sizes, about names, about missiles. But behind each of these ships is a crew. 160 people, each with a family in Zapadnaya Litsa or Severodvinsk, each with an apartment in a closed settlement, each with children who grew up on this Kola land where the polar night lasted half a year. And in these families, at the end of the 80s, the beginning of the 90s, one and the same thing began to happen. Men returned from the sea, and the country for which they'd stood watch under the ice for half a year was disappearing. Oath to one country, service to another. Uniform, the same. Shoulderboards, the same. Only the flag changed. Their ships still stood at the piers of Zapadnaya Litsa, still went out to sea, still fired missiles. But the meaning for which they were built was beginning to melt before their eyes. And here a third force enters this story. Not Soviet, not Russian, foreign, with its own money, its own programs, and a very clear interest. 3 Typhoons out of 6 were cut up for scrap with the money of the United States of America. That very country against which they were built, that very country whose 200 cities lay in the sights of the R-39 missiles, that very one whose satellites in the 80s tried every day to make out at least something over boathouse number 55. And it was precisely it that paid for these submarines to be no more. The program was called Cooperative Threat Reduction. In English, Cooperative Threat Reduction, abbreviated CTR. In the Russian tradition, it's also called the Nunn-Lugar program, after the surnames of 2 American senators who pushed it through, the Democrat Sam Nunn from Georgia and the Republican Richard Lugar from Indiana. A Democrat and a Republican together, which in American politics is rare in general. And here they converged. And their idea was this: the Soviet Union collapsed. On its ruins remained an enormous amount of nuclear weapons, missiles, warheads, submarines, strategic aviation. If all of this is left as is, it could spread across the world, to terrorists, third countries, the black market. So it's necessary to help Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan quickly and safely eliminate all of it. And the Americans are ready to pay for this, from their own budget. The logic is strategic. It's cheaper to pay now for the destruction of someone else's arsenal than later to build missile defense against the same weapon that ended up in someone else's hands. And so the program starts working. From 91, 92, into it fall missiles, silos, strategic bombers, test ranges, and into it fall the Akulas. There's one nuance here that many confuse. The Typhoons weren't withdrawn from combat status instantly. Everything was slower and sadder. What actually happened? The R-39 missiles, that very main caliber for which the ship was built at all, had a limited service life. Solid fuel charges, warranty frames, tactical technical regulations. By these regulations, a missile could be stored and kept in the silo a certain number of years. Then the charge had to be either disposed of or reloaded. And to reload means to produce new missiles. And the production of R-39 missiles after the collapse of the Union stopped. The first stages, if you recall, were made by Yuzhmash in Dnepropetrovsk. And Dnepropetrovsk is now another country. The engines, from the Bisk Altai. The cooperation crumbled. The technological chains fell apart. There was an attempt to make a modernized version, the BARC, Project RKD-19UTTKH. In the 90s, it was being developed precisely to rearm the Typhoons. 3 test launches, 3 failures. In 98, the government made a decision to halt the work. All resources, all money, the whole bet were transferred to another missile, the Bulava. And the Bulava didn't fit the Akula. It was developed already for the new generation submarines, the Boris. And so by the early 2000s, you get a situation. There are 6 enormous ships. There are their crews, there are bases, there are silos, there's everything. There's only one thing missing: new missiles for these silos. And without missiles, the Typhoon is no longer a strategic missile carrier. It's a very large and very expensive to maintain chunk of iron underwater. Formally, they were withdrawn into reserve. Informally, preparation for disposal was beginning. The first to go was TK-202 in '99, sent to Severodvinsk to Sevmash under the blade. The dismantling of a nuclear submarine, for those who don't know, is a separate complex procedure. First, the spent nuclear fuel is unloaded from the reactors. This is done at the shore base of the Zvozdochka plant. According to Bologna, the first such unloading from an Akula was carried out in April 2003. Then the reactor block is cut out separately, as a whole, a chunk of the hull. It's sent for long-term storage. By reports, the reactor block of TK-202 was taken to a temporary storage point near Murmansk in 2007. And the rest of the ship, they cut: titanium, steel, cables, mechanisms, the rubber hull coating, 800 tons of special rubber. All of it goes to scrap, to remelting, into separate batches of metal for sale. The largest submarine in human history, over a couple of years, turns into a set of metal blocks of various sizes, neatly stacked off to the side of the boathouse. After TK-202 came TK-13 and TK-12, Simbirsk. By the mid-2000s, 3 Akulas were already dismantled. And it was precisely a significant part of the costs of this work that the United States covered under the Nunn-Lugar program. And here I want to pause and say one thing, directly, without embellishment. By the most accessible estimate, both ours and Western, the money the U.S. invested in disposing of the Akulas was part of the total sum of the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. In the overall total over all the years of this program's work, the Americans spent about $10 billion on everything together: missiles, submarines, warheads, test ranges, aviation. The exact sum for the 3 Typhoons specifically, as a separate line item in open form, you won't find. It's blurred. But the very fact that the destruction of the largest Soviet strategic submarines was paid for from the American budget is openly acknowledged. And at the same time, here's what I want to emphasize. While 3 Akulas went under the blade, their contemporaries, the American Ohios, the Americans not only didn't cut, on the contrary, some of them they modernized and extended the service life all the way to 2026. So in parallel with the disposal of our largest weapon, on the other shore of the ocean, work was underway to extend the life of its direct competitor. When I first seriously noted this in my notebook, a feeling of bitter irony wouldn't leave me. Not victory, not defeat, just irony. The same story. An aging strategic missile carrier. 2 countries resolved differently. With us, destroy. With them, renew. And you know what's important here? No one specifically can be blamed for this. The situation of the 90s is a separate, hard story. There was no money in the country. Infrastructure was disintegrating. Cooperation with Ukraine collapsed. Missiles were running out. Crews went months without pay. The garrison in Zapadnaya Litsa survived as best it could. In such conditions, to bear 6 giant ships with their titanium, reactors, crews of 160 people, a separate missile carrier transport, a separate shore base, the state physically could not. This must be acknowledged honestly. Another question is that for the Americans, this turned out convenient, very convenient. And here submarine fleet veterans said, and still say aloud, that simple thing which I can't help but share with them. The state created these ships with the whole country. From the Caspian to Vladivostok, more than 1,000 enterprises, 1,200 people from one Sevmash, with medals, the 8th wonder of the world of the Soviet defense complex. And then, over some decade, 3 of the 6 were sent under the blade, and the one who paid for it was the one against whom they were built. Academician Kovalyov, that very designer we've talked about so much in this video, appealed then to the highest authorities, wrote letters, tried to save at least part of the series, tried to explain that a super weapon of such a class can't be recreated from scratch in 10 years if it should be needed. To him, if you believe the publications in Rossiyskaya Gazeta, they so skillfully multiplied pluses by minuses in bureaucratic replies that no measures followed. And in this, Kovalyov is not to blame. Not the fleet, not the submariners. The situation was bigger than all of them put together. But one thing did work out. One submarine of the 6 survived. And not just survived, it turned out to have an entirely special fate. Not like its sisters, not quiet, not under the blade, its own. It alone of all was withdrawn into a separate status. It alone of all was modernized, not cut up. It alone of all was refitted for an entirely new task, to test the weapon that was supposed to come to replace it itself. It was precisely aborted that they would later launch the missiles for the sake of which, in essence, its sisters were being decommissioned. Irony upon irony. And the name of this submarine is as if taken from a completely different era, from under the ice straight into the Russian Middle Ages. Aboard the Dmitry Donskoy, in the rite of initiation into submariners, the traditional ship's sledgehammer was replaced with a real combat mace. Heavy, forged, with spikes. A real one. The kind that in the Russian Middle Ages broke through armor. For those who don't know what this is about, submariners have an old fleet tradition. The initiation of a young sailor into real submariners. Usually a heavy sledgehammer is rolled out on deck, and the newcomer has to symbolically strike it or take it in his hands, as a sign that he's been accepted. The sledgehammer on all Soviet and Russian submarines was one and the same, a working one from the tool set, and on the Dmitry Donskoy, a mace. And this is no accident, because the new missile that this very ship tested from 2005 to 2010 was also called Bulava, mace, R-30, that very one for whose sake the Bark project was closed. For whose sake, to be completely honest, Donskoy's sisters were decommissioned. An irony hard to invent. The old giant, the only survivor of the 6, tests the weapon for the ships that came to replace it. How did it survive at all? Here it's interesting. The lead ship of the series, TK-208, launched in September 80, in service, from 81. By 91, it had served its first cycle and went to Sevmash for a major overhaul and modernization under Project 941U. It came and got stuck. The repair was halted in 91. No money. Cooperation falling apart. The R-39 program winding down. The ship stands at the pier. Not combat, not dismantled, just standing. And so, for 5 years, only in 96 do the works resume. No longer under Project 941U, but under the updated one, 941UM. And now the task is not what it was. From a combat strategic boat, Donskoy is reworked into a test stand. One of its silos for the R-39 missile, weighing 90 tons, is redesigned for the new, much smaller Bulava. A new launch tube is inserted inside the old silo. This is, if you like remaking a factory oven for different cookware. Difficult, but possible. The works last until 2002. On the 26th of July, 2002, the ship is recommissioned into the Northern Fleet. And in October, it's given the name Dmitry Donskoy, in honor of that very prince who in 1380 defeated Mamai on the Kulikovo field. A strange combination, a nuclear missile carrier of the late 20th century and a name from the Russian Middle Ages. But in the context of this whole story, actually very fitting. A giant from another era, having survived into a new one. And its second life begins. The one for which, in fact, it was kept. From 2005 to 2010, the Dmitry Donskoy becomes a test platform for the Bulava. In all, more than a dozen launches were carried out from its board. Not all successful. About the Bulava, there's a separate story. There were failures and setbacks and years of refinement. But it was precisely the old Akula that carried this program while the new Boris were still being finished. And here the irony thickens to the point of completeness. In July 2014, Donskoy participated in the state trials of the lead Bore-A, the cruiser Vladimir Monomakh. That is, the old man ensured the trials of the ship that was supposed to finally decommission it. Monomakh and Donskoy, two Russian princes, separated by 3 centuries of history and 1 generation of submarine missile carriers. What hooks me in this story is one detail that, at first glance, has nothing to do with weapons. In 2007, in Donskoy's wardroom, they set up the exhibition "To the Glory of Russia" from the State Museum Reserve Kulikovo Field, dedicated to the Battle of Kulikovo, right on a combat nuclear submarine. Between compartments with reactors and a torpedo tube stands about a battle 600 years ago. Some call this a beautiful gesture, others an attempt to create a legend for oneself at a moment when there's no one left to create a legend. In my view, both are true. A ship for which no service in the old sense remains gets another one, a symbolic one. And this symbol works. People come aboard, see that this is not just floating metal, but floating memory, and they remember. By 2017, the Dmitry Donskoy is already more of a showpiece machine than a combat one. That same year, it makes an unprecedented transit from the Northern Fleet to the Baltic as part of a group of ships. It passes from Severodvinsk past Scandinavia to Kronstadt, participates in the International Maritime Defense Show and the Parade on Navy Day in St. Petersburg. Its appearance in the Gulf of Finland alone is an event. No one remembers such a behemoth going under its own power past Denmark and Sweden. The whole coast photographs it. And then, silence. In 2018, 19 Donskoy is put into repair with an eye to further use under the Bulava. In June 2019, the first post-repair trials in the White Sea. Everything goes as usual. But in July 2022, the first reports appear in the media that the ship is planned to be withdrawn from the fleet. The name Dmitry Donskoy is freed up for a new submarine under construction, already of Project 955A, Bore A. That is, the name is passed on further, down the chain. Then come months of uncertainty. First they write that it was withdrawn, then that no, still in service. It supported the trials of the new cruisers, Krasnoyarsk and Generalissimus Suvorov. In December 22, a new wave, the ship is being prepared for withdrawal. The main crew is already going ashore, only the technical one remains. And in February 2023, it finally happens. The heavy nuclear submarine cruiser of strategic designation TK-208, Dmitry Donskoy, is withdrawn from the combat composition of the Navy of the Russian Federation, sent to Severodvinsk to await a decision on its fate. And here begins a dispute that is still not finished. Some veterans and public organizations demand, don't cut it, preserve it, make Donskoy into a floating museum. Put it somewhere in Kronstadt, in the Patriot Park, or in St. Petersburg, so that people can come aboard, see this behemoth from the inside, touch that very mace in the initiation rite. Let future generations know that we built such ships. Others say, sorry, a museum is beautiful, but the reactor has to be unloaded, the nuclear fuel has to be disposed of. Maintaining such a behemoth, even in museum status, is colossal money. It's easier to dismantle it by the standard procedure as its sisters were dismantled. As of March 2025, a decision has been voiced to make Donskoy a museum, to install it in St. Petersburg. If you believe the materials, the submarine fleet veterans managed to defend precisely this option. But honestly, I present this for now as a decision of intent, not as a fact. Because from the announcement, we'll make a museum, to a real pier with a gangway open to visitors, many more years may pass, and much may still change. So the fate of the lead Typhoon, the only survivor of 6, is right now exactly at that point which you'd call neither an end nor a continuation. It's not on duty, not under the blade, not on a pedestal. It's at the pier, in waiting. As if the whole country around it is also waiting for something no one can yet formulate. And you know what seems important to me precisely about this moment of history? Over 40+ years, one ship outlived 3 countries. It was built in the Soviet Union, underwent a major overhaul and got a new name in Yeltsin's Russian Federation, tested the Bulava already in the next era, and went out of service in a 4th. Not every person in our parts outlives as many state stages as this ship outlived. And now let's step back and calmly look at this whole story as a whole. From the very beginning, from that enormous missile around which the submarine was built, from the water carrier that the fleet disliked, from the pool and sauna that were installed so that people wouldn't go mad over half a year under the ice, from Brezhnev, who uttered the word typhoon, from the crane operator who perhaps never existed, from Clancy and his Red October, from the missile burned in the silo in September 91, from 3 submarines under the blade and 1 into repair, and from the Dmitry Donskoy, which right now, as I record this, still stands in Severodvinsk. And to ask ourselves a question: what in this whole story remained without an answer? We've been talking about this submarine for almost an hour, and now, something short, but in my view, the most important. We still know almost nothing about it. Look, we know the dimensions. We know the number of missiles. We know who the designer is. We know who cut the hull and the handover dock. We know what was in the wardroom, down to the sauna and the oak boards. We know the formula from Brezhnev's accountability report at the Congress. And we even know who played Ramius in the Hollywood film. And now, what we don't know. We don't know where exactly the Typhoons traveled on their combat services. Not a single exact patrol map of the 18th Division exists in open sources. There are general words: the Arctic, under the ice cap, in near-polar regions. Fragmentary mentions of TK-12 Simbirsk's patrol in '87 with crew changes by icebreaker. About this patrol, a handful of lines. Neither start dates nor end dates, nor a route, nor where exactly the ship reached. To the shores of Greenland? To Alaska? Beyond the pole? We don't know. We don't know how many times the Typhoons met under the ice with American or British Hunter submarines, and that such meetings happened, there's almost no doubt. It was precisely for this that the Americans kept their Sturgeons and Los Angeleses under the Arctic cap. But what happened there between them is in the archives, and most likely for a long time. We don't know the whole truth about the incidents, about the burned missile in the silo on TK-17 Arkhangelsk in September 91 we spoke. Yes, but far from all the details are open there. There are mentions of other emergencies that happened in those years, in general phrases, without names and without documents. Part of them is still not published anywhere. We don't know who exactly died on the Akulas over the years of their service, and there were deaths. This is confirmed at the level of general mentions by veterans. But lists in open form don't exist, and I fear never will now. Not because someone is hiding it, but because much simply wasn't preserved. It was written off as illness, written off as an accident on land. It went into silence. We don't know the whole truth about the photo in Jane's defense and about the crane operator. We said, this is oral tradition. Neither a case, nor a surname, nor a number, and most likely, none will ever appear now. We don't know whether there was a real order from above to preserve at least one Akula as a symbol, or on the contrary, there was a command to cut everything. I personally lean toward the view that decisions about the ship's fate in the 2000s were made not by a single plan, but in fragments, under the pressure of circumstances, money, international obligations, and internal disputes. But the full picture, honestly, we don't have. And now, if you'll allow me, about the most, in my view, difficult part, about what in such stories goes first, about the witnesses. Look, there are layers of people who saw the Typhoons from the inside. The first layer, the designers. Kovalyov, his colleagues at Rubin. Some of them left memoirs, some didn't. Kovalyov died in 2011. Many of his comrades are no longer here. The second layer, the builders. Thousands of people at Sevmash, in workshop number 55 and nearby. Their stories, only in oral form, in local Severodvinsk archives, in family albums. Some wrote recollections, some didn't. Many of them left without managing to tell aloud the most interesting part, that very texture that lives in a person and dies with them. The third layer, the crews, the submariners of the 18th Division. Of those who stood watch on the Akulas, who went on high-latitude patrols, who served in the 90s in conditions about which few can speak calmly today. Some of them live to this day. Many of them are already old men, and how many years they have left to tell about what isn't in the archives is a very sad question. And the fourth layer, that very one which, if you recall, I named in the chapter about secrecy, the auxiliary one, crane operators, outside welders, pier workers, women from the shore canteens, headquarters cleaners, relatives of submariners, teachers in the closed settlements, people whom no one ever asked about what they saw and heard. No one apparently ever will. And this is the very real dark zone of the whole Akula story. What hooks me in this story, and honestly won't let me go, is this. About the largest weapon in human history, we, the people who built it, have fewer open materials than the Americans have about their Ohio. Once more, so it sinks in. There are detailed books about American submarines, with photographs of compartments, with patrol maps, with declassified reports. About our Typhoon, a set of the same reference data circulating from article to article, plus several designers' memoirs, plus separate interviews with commanders like Oleg Tsibin, plus veterans' accounts in narrow publications. And that's all. This is not a conspiracy. This is, rather, a habit of the state to keep its weapon in the shadows, and a habit of people not to ask. And the most bitter is that behind this silence, concrete human fates go. Who on how many submarines spent how many years traveling under the ice? What the name was of the ship's doctor who diagnosed a young lieutenant at the end of the 6th month of a patrol? Who first saw an American sturgeon through the periscope? Who wrote a letter to Moscow in '93 that the crew hadn't been paid for 4 months? All of this is somewhere, in someone's notebooks, in someone's letters, in someone's memory, while this memory is alive. And if even one such person, or even one relative of a submariner, is listening to us now, I want to say a simple thing. Record it. Write it down. Let it be 5 lines in a notebook. Let it be a cassette. Let it be a phone recording of your father's or grandfather's voice. Let it be in someone else's cloud. Let it be in a thick notebook. Let it be on a voice recorder in the kitchen over tea. Because what won't be recorded will be lost completely, with no right of restoration. And with this feeling of enduring anxiety that we've missed and keep missing more than we preserve, I bring us to the finale. Not the finale of the story itself, it's not yet over. The finale of the video. Severodvinsk. A pier. February or March, no one will tell you the exact date. Wind from the White Sea, biting, that very one that cuts the face not southern style, but northern, evenly and stubbornly. At the pier, a hull. Just a hull. Without missiles, they were unloaded back in the 2000s. Without a crew, it left. Without a flag, it's been lowered. The rubber skin is cracked in places. The paint has burned on the sunny side. The sail, that very one that broke ice 2.5 meters thick, now breaks only the wind. And beneath it, water. Quiet. Severodvinsk water. Familiar to it for 40+ years. The largest submarine in human history stands at the pier and is silent. This giant became quietest, not in battle, not on patrol, not under the ice where it knew how to hide from other sonars, but here, at the wall of the factory that assembled it, as if it had come home. You know, I kept thinking about how to end this video, and I understood this. Inside it, somewhere in the wardroom, until recently stood that very exhibition, about the Kulikovo field, about Prince Dmitri, about the distant battle of the year 1380, and right there aboard, that very mace with which they initiate people into submariners, a medieval weapon, right in the middle of a nuclear cruiser. And this detail just won't fall into order in my head. It's about everything at once. About the fact that this ship is about Russia, not only about a weapon. About the fact that the Typhoon outlived the country that built it. About the fact that the old mace in its corridor is heavier than all the disarmament documents put together. About the fact that when the armor is already gone, the mace still remained. And probably about one more thing. About the fact that a real weapon always outlives the one who created it. And a real person, if remembered, outlives his weapon. Kovalyov is no more. Mikheyev, no more. Brezhnev, no more. The crews of the first patrols, also almost no one left. 3 sisters of the lead ship, cut up and remelted. 2 await their turn. And TK-208 stands. Quietly. Silently. Still standing for now. They won't build such a thing again. Most likely, never. Not because it's impossible, but because there's no reason to. The era in which a person needed to hide the largest weapon in history under the ice This era is passing, no matter how you look at it, rolling off beyond the horizon. On the other side of the horizon is something else. What's there? I don't know, and no one knows. But definitely not typhoons. Not like these. Not in this concept. Not on this scale. And so, if you've watched to this point, and this, by the way, is over an hour, I want to ask you for one thing. On the 55 Plus channel here, the comments are usually calm, respectful, written by people who remember that era personally. And I know that among you there are those who lived nearby back then. Maybe some of you worked at Sevmash, or served conscription in Severodvinsk, or knew a sailor from Zapadnaya Litsa, or went to school with a submariner's child, or simply remember February 81, when from the Congress podium this word first sounded, Typhoon. And do you remember where you were when you first heard about this submarine? On television, in a newspaper, from someone you knew? At what moment did this word enter your life? I'm very curious. Write in the comments. We sometimes gather such answers into a separate video. If good material accumulates, we'll definitely make it. And one last thing. Subscribe. Not for the count, for the memory. Such stories about how a country built the largest weapon in the world and then let it go into silence, these stories leave along with the people who remember them. As long as we remember, they're not forgotten. As soon as we stop, they're gone. Subscribe to remember. Without this, such ships and such names simply disappear. And let the ship stand, as long as it stands.